Modern political life clings to a paradox. We proclaim rule by the people even as the people steadily lose all meaningful power. Democracy, once a rallying cry against tyranny, has become an altar upon which political legitimacy is ritualistically sacrificed to bureaucracy, media manipulation, and oligarchic entrenchment. The very word, democracy, has grown so sacred, so reflexively repeated, that to examine its structure critically is to commit a kind of blasphemy in the civic religion of the modern West. But heresy is sometimes necessary for clarity, and clarity demands we ask, who truly governs in democratic societies? Is it the citizen, casting a vote every few years? Or is it the permanent class, the unelected, the unaccountable, the institutional elite, who shape, interpret, and enforce the boundaries of acceptable opinion and policy? Beneath the pageantry of elections and the language of equality lies a cold political reality. Democracy does not eliminate hierarchy, it conceals it. Its genius is not in abolishing oligarchy, but in sanctifying it with the symbols of popular will. This essay contends that the democratic form, far from securing liberty, tends toward oligarchy by its very nature. It is not a deviation or corruption of the democratic ideal. It is its logical unfolding. Every institutional safeguard meant to empower the citizen becomes, over time, a mechanism of elite capture. Every crisis accelerates this process. Every expansion of participation conceals a narrowing of control, and all of it occurs under the comforting illusion that we are governing ourselves. To confront this requires stripping democracy of its mythology. It means recognizing that elite rule is not merely a feature of corrupted democracies, it is their default state. It means understanding how the modern elite is not bound to the people it rules, but insulated from them, socially, economically, and spiritually. It means observing how every political emergency becomes a justification for expanding the state, and how tolerance becomes a cudgel for ideological conformity. It means seeing how leadership under democratic auspices does not rotate as advertised, but calcifies. And it means confronting the reality that democratic incentives produce not virtue and foresight, but consumption, cowardice, and decline. In the pages that follow, we will not appeal to abstract ideals, nor will we dwell on promises that were never meant to be kept. Instead, we will examine the structural logic of democratic power, not as it should be, but as it is. Not with reverence, but with the dispassionate clarity that truth demands. This is not a lament, it is a diagnosis, and perhaps, for those willing to see through the veil, the beginning of a cure. Part 1. The oligarchic nature of democratic rule. Democracy, we are told, is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. But history, and more importantly, political structure, suggests otherwise. What democracy claims and what it delivers are two different things. The former is aspiration, the latter, inevitability. And the inevitable outcome is this: every democracy becomes an oligarchy, not through some external corruption or betrayal, but through the very mechanisms that make it work. The moment any political system begins to scale, gathering mass participation, coordinating resources, administering laws, it must organize itself. And all organization generates hierarchy. Leadership is delegated and then entrenched. What begins as representation becomes domination. The few who manage the machinery of the democratic system inevitably become its owners, in all but name. Elections, parties, committees, these are not safeguards against tyranny. They are the instruments through which it evolves a democratic mask. This is not a new cycle in history. It is a permanent law of political life. All societies, however, they originate, stabilize through the rise of a ruling class. Whether monarchic, aristocratic, or democratic in origin, the outcome converges: the concentration of power into the hands of those who know how to wield it. Democratic systems simply have the added layer of pretending they don't. Indeed, the genius of the modern democratic state lies in its ability to disguise the continuity of elite rule. The faces may change, but the class remains. Popular sovereignty becomes a performance, a managed consensus mediated by institutions, parties, and mass media. Citizens are allowed to select among pre-approved factions, but the real levers of power are out of reach. Legislation, policy, finance, and law are orchestrated by individuals and networks whose continuity spans generations, immune to the cycles of the electoral calendar. This is not to suggest that all elites are the same, or that their interests never conflict. But conflict among elites is not the same as challenge from below. Revolutions of the ballot box often amount to rearranging the furniture in the same house. There is no moment when the people actually govern. There is only the illusion of control, fed to the masses through slogans and ceremonies, while the administrative state deepens its roots. Consider the nature of political parties, once heralded as vehicles of civic engagement. In truth, they operate as oligarchic machines designed to manage consent and restrict choice. Leadership emerges through patronage, manipulation, and internal loyalty, not popular deliberation. The party becomes a filter, not a conduit. Its task is not to reflect the people's will, but to shape and discipline it into something acceptable to the permanent managerial order. And those who rise through its ranks are already assimilated into its logic. Even movements that claim to resist the system fall into this pattern. Revolutionary parties, populist insurgencies, grassroots crusades, they all become indistinguishable from the structures they claim to oppose once they scale. They hire consultants, they appeal to donors, they court media, they chase polls, they institutionalize, and once institutionalized, they become oligarchic. The rhetoric may remain radical, but the structure becomes identical. The deeper truth here is that the concept of the people is not a stable political subject. It is a fluid abstraction, easily invoked, rarely defined. Who are they? What do they want? How does one measure their will? In practice, the people is whatever the ruling class needs it to be at the moment. It can mean the majority when it supports the regime, the minority when it serves progressive narratives, or the oppressed when moral leverage is required. But never, never is it allowed to mean anything that might actually threaten the continuity of elite power. Thus, the modern state rules in the name of the people, but never by them. The ballot becomes a sacrament, not a tool. The vote sanctifies the system, not the citizen. And the more sacred the vote becomes, the more distant actual power is from the voter. This is the paradox of democratic legitimacy. The more it is invoked, the less real it becomes. In truth, what we call democracy is better described as elective oligarchy. It is ruled by a self-replicating caste of administrators, experts, and influencers who operate within a closed circuit of institutional power. Their origins may vary: academia, finance, media, bureaucracy, but their worldview is remarkably uniform. They believe in technocratic management, in procedural consensus, in globalist ideals, and in the managerial state as the highest expression of political life. What they do not believe in, cannot believe in, is any vision of society rooted in hierarchy, transcendence, or natural order. They are not monarchs, but they wield sovereign power. They are not priests, but they define orthodoxy. They are not soldiers, but they wage wars. They are not of the people, but they speak in their name. And above all, they believe themselves to be neutral arbiters, disinterested servants of reason and democracy, rather than what they are, a governing class. This is not to suggest that all elites are the same, or that their interests never conflict. But conflict among elites is not the same as challenge from below. Revolutions of the ballot box often amount to rearranging the furniture in the same house. There is no moment when the people actually govern. There is only the illusion of control, fed to the masses through slogans and ceremonies, while the administrative state deepens its roots. This is the first truth one must confront if one wishes to speak honestly about modern democracy. Before we can speak of justice or representation or reform, we must admit this, that we do not live under the rule of the people. We live under a system designed to convince us that we do. If modern democracy has become a masquerade for oligarchy, then the next logical question is, who are these elites? What do they want? And why has their rule become increasingly disconnected from the societies over which they preside? The answer is not simply wealth or pedigree. Today's ruling class is not defined by aristocratic lineage or inherited land. It is not national in character, nor particularly loyal to any cultural or religious tradition. Rather, the new elite is managerial, a class of highly mobile, highly credentialed administrators, executives, experts, and strategists who view the political realm not as a matter of virtue or responsibility, but as a system to be optimized. Their rise is not accidental. It is the result of structural incentives within liberal democracy itself, which favors technical competence over moral vision, procedure over principle, and performance over permanence. These elites do not conquer, they manage. They do not govern in the traditional sense, they administer. Their authority derives not from any metaphysical source, divine right, natural hierarchy, ancestral responsibility, but from claims to neutrality, efficiency, and procedural fairness. They present themselves as servants of the public will, but operate well above and beyond the sphere of public accountability. Their legitimacy is reinforced not through consent of the governed in any meaningful sense, but through credentials, media narratives, legal insulation, and economic interdependence. And crucially, they do not rule in solidarity with the populations over which they preside. In fact, they increasingly view themselves as detached from those populations. They live in global cities, not national communities. Their loyalties are to professional networks, financial systems, and ideological fellow travelers across borders, not to particular peoples, places, or traditions. This is why so much of modern political discontent takes the form of a populist scream, not against elites per se, but against elites who no longer even pretend to represent those they govern. The rupture is profound. In earlier eras, rulers were at least physically embedded in the societies they ruled. They shared religion, language, history, and fate. But the new elites are rootless by design. Their strength lies in their detachment. They move from capital to capital, from university to NGO, from tech firm to think tank. Their children are educated in the same institutions, trained in the same moral indifference, and launched into the same cosmopolitan class. This class, for all its claims to diversity, is ideologically monolithic. It believes in the supremacy of expertise, in the irrelevance of borders, in the inevitable progress of global democracy, and above all, in its own moral superiority. It has, in a sense, replaced the aristocracy not with equality, but with credentialed technocracy, a regime in which authority flows from bureaucratic complexity and social signaling rather than virtue or responsibility. Such a class cannot tolerate genuine democratic will, because that will is unpredictable, unsophisticated, and dangerously moral. The people might vote the wrong way. They might believe in things the elite has declared retrograde: nation, faith, family, or sovereignty. And so the ruling class responds not by engaging, but by insulating itself further. It creates supranational institutions. It empowers judges and regulators. It expands the administrative state. It governs not by persuasion or accountability, but by procedure and exclusion. This dynamic is not hypothetical. It has played out repeatedly in recent decades. When citizens in Europe voted against EU treaties, the votes were simply ignored or rerun. When populist leaders win elections, they are treated as threats to democracy, not because they seize power unlawfully, but because they disrupt the narrative that democracy is always liberal. Democracy, we are told, must protect itself from the people. We see it in France, where candidates outside the centrist consensus are systematically demonized regardless of electoral success. We see it in Germany, where significant segments of the population vote for opposition parties, only to be told their votes are illegitimate because they are labeled far right. We see it in Romania, where external institutions can effectively override domestic elections if the outcomes threaten the liberal order. This is the betrayal, not of democracy in the abstract, but of the democratic promise. The elites do not merely ignore the people, they actively govern against them. They reinterpret their wishes, reframe their discontent, and replace substance with symbolism. A rainbow flag at an embassy, a diversity officer at a corporation, a televised speech about inclusion, all while the regime remains untouched, the power untouched, and the trajectory unmoved. Representation becomes theater, consent becomes a managed illusion, and governance becomes increasingly remote, abstract, and unchallengeable. This is the world the managerial elite has built, one where elections change little, laws are written in unreadable jargon, crises are used to justify expansion, and loyalty to the common good is replaced by loyalty to the managerial process itself. The people may still believe they are sovereign, but sovereignty, in truth, has been transferred quietly, effectively, and perhaps irreversibly to a class that neither loves them, nor fears them, nor even considers them. A government built on liberty ought to treat power as a temporary concession, exercised in restraint and relinquished in peace. That, at least, is the myth. But modern democratic regimes behave in precisely the opposite way. Power is treated as permanent, cumulative, and most easily expanded in moments of collective fear. Crises, whether natural or manufactured, become the accelerants of leviathan, the justification for growing the state far beyond its previous limits. There is a distinct pattern. An emergency emerges: economic collapse, foreign threat, public health panic, climate alarm, and the democratic regime responds by assuming extraordinary powers. Bureaucratic agencies are empowered, executive authority is broadened, civil liberties are suspended, funds are allocated, restrictions imposed, surveillance expanded, and then the crisis passes, or, more often, is declared to have passed, but the powers remain. They are not scaled back, they are normalized. This phenomenon is not a flaw of democracy, it is a feature. The machinery of mass governance thrives on instability because instability legitimizes intervention. In theory, democracies are accountable and slow-moving. In practice, they use speed and ambiguity during emergencies to bypass deliberation and entrench power. And the citizen, frightened and uncertain, consents, temporarily, of course, until temporary becomes habitual. There is no clearer sign of this than the administrative state's response to modern crises. Under the guise of expert management, entire swathes of life are placed under executive or bureaucratic control. Health mandates override religious worship. Censorship is outsourced to private platforms in the name of safety. Financial instruments are weaponized to enforce ideological compliance. All of it is explained as pragmatic, rational, scientific. None of it is rolled back. Democracy, under this model, becomes an engine for perpetual expansion, because each crisis creates a new precedent, a new tool, a new legal exception that later becomes part of the norm. Yesterday's emergency power is today's standard operating procedure, and the populace, conditioned to see security as the supreme good, accepts the exchange of freedom for safety with growing regularity. This is what might be called the ratchet effect. In times of crisis, state power ratchets upward. When the crisis ends, the gear doesn't move back, it locks in place, and the next emergency begins from a new baseline of control. This is how republics quietly become soft tyrannies, not through coup d'etat or outright dictatorship, but through the slow bureaucratization of every corner of life in the name of democratic protection. It would be one thing if these emergency expansions were rare, but they are not. In fact, the modern state manufactures its own conditions of emergency. It thrives on the exception. It depends on it. Every potential threat becomes a justification to intervene. Disinformation, climate risk, inequality, hate speech, public health, domestic extremism. The list is endless because it must be. A democratic regime that cannot justify its expansion through fear will eventually have to justify its limits through principle, and principle is precisely what it lacks. There is, at the heart of the liberal democratic project, a discomfort with finality. No issue is ever truly resolved, no power ever surrendered, no authority ever conclusively grounded. Everything is open-ended, contestable, and revisable, except the state's prerogative to act. Thus, emergency becomes not the suspension of politics, but its highest form. The state acts most decisively not when it is at peace, but when it is panicked, and panic becomes permanent. This dynamic fundamentally alters the citizen's relationship to law and power. Instead of being the source of legitimacy, the citizen becomes the object of management. Instead of setting the limits of governance, he becomes the variable to be adjusted. The emergency becomes an existential justification for treating freedom as conditional, privacy as suspicious, and dissent as dangerous. What emerges is not a dictatorship in the classical sense. There are still elections, still constitutions, still newspapers and courtrooms. But beneath these surface features lies a regime that governs through exception. The legal is always provisional. The procedures are always flexible. The system is always ready to protect democracy, even if that means overriding its foundational principles. This is the paradox. The more democracy is threatened, the less democratic it becomes in response. And because the system defines its own threats, there is no built-in end to this process. The emergency becomes the new normal. The citizen then finds himself in a regime where every new danger, real or imagined, justifies new restrictions, where the laws are always shifting, where institutions claim neutrality but act with increasing aggression, and where liberty becomes not a birthright but a privilege contingent on compliance. This is not tyranny as our ancestors knew it. It is something more insidious. It is the progressive conversion of democracy into leviathan, not with a crown or a sword, but with a mask of compassion and a vocabulary of rights. Power expands not despite democracy, but because of how democracy interprets danger. The will to protect becomes the will to dominate. And the most dangerous part? The people themselves have been taught to cheer it on. One of the proudest boasts of liberal democracy is its supposed openness, the grand promise that all voices may speak, all opinions may be aired, and all beliefs tolerated. It presents itself as the marketplace of ideas, where no dogma can dominate and no orthodoxy can coerce. But this promise, like so many others, proves illusory under close inspection. For in truth, the democratic order does not foster diversity of thought. It manufactures consent through more subtle, but no less effective, means than its totalitarian cousins. The ideology of liberal democracy is not neutral. It cloaks itself in procedural language, in appeals to freedom and inclusion. But beneath this rhetoric lies a very specific moral worldview. It is a creed, a secular religion masquerading as pluralism. And like any religion, It demands conversion, punishes heresy, and reserves its harshest judgments for apostates. In the modern democratic order, to dissent from the reigning orthodoxy is not simply to be mistaken, it is to be morally defective. The permissible spectrum of opinion narrows with each passing year, even as the language of diversity expands. The regime tolerates disagreement only within carefully patrolled boundaries, disagreement that reinforces the frame, not challenges it. Any belief that arises from a worldview outside this frame, be it religious, ancestral, hierarchical, or metaphysical, is not merely contested, it is labeled dangerous. The tools of enforcement are rarely jackboots or secret police. They are far more elegant and far more effective. They are university codes of conduct, corporate diversity policies, social credit systems disguised as reputation scores, algorithmic suppression of disinformation, and an omnipresent media class that defines the moral vocabulary of the age. The result is soft totalitarianism, a regime of moral coercion that governs not the body, but the soul. This is the great irony of modern liberal societies. They have abolished theological authority in name, only to reinstate it in practice. The state no longer enforces religion, but it enforces a moral creed that functions precisely like one. Its commandments are equality, progress, and individual autonomy. Its sacraments are public confession, symbolic gestures, and self-declared identity. Its heresies are hierarchy, tradition, and belief in objective moral order. And like any dogma, this creed does not tolerate rivals. Religious convictions that claim universal truth must be privatized. National loyalty must be subordinated to international norms. Family authority must be replaced with state oversight. The citizen is free to believe anything, so long as it changes nothing. What is especially perverse is that this conformity is sold as liberation. You are free, you are told, to be whoever you want, as long as that you is defined by the prevailing categories of identity politics. You are empowered to speak your truth, as long as your truth aligns with the system's definitions of harm, dignity, and inclusion. The regime does not silence outright, it redefines. It does not burn books, it algorithmically buries them. It does not imprison dissenters, it renders them invisible, unemployable, or socially radioactive. This is not the freedom of the ancients, rooted in virtue and self-mastery. Nor is it the stern liberty of the early republics, defined by duty and sacrifice. It is the freedom of consumption, performance, and indulgence. And beneath its glittering surface lies a profound emptiness, a society that has lost not only the will to debate truth, but even the belief that truth exists. This drift toward ideological hegemony is not accidental. It is the result of democracy's deeper structural need for legitimacy. Unlike monarchies or theocracies, which rest on transcendent claims, democratic regimes depend on constant affirmation by the public. But a public that is truly free, truly plural, might withdraw that affirmation. It might choose wrongly. It might believe inconvenient things. And so the regime must shape the public, softly at first, then more aggressively. The culture becomes curated, the history books revised, the statues toppled, the language policed, all to ensure that the demos will never again be tempted to remember that it was once free to believe what it pleased. And all of this is done, of course, in the name of democracy. The suppression of dissent is recast as the defense of tolerance. The erasure of tradition is framed as progress. The silencing of opposing views is called the protection of vulnerable communities. The tyranny of the new orthodoxy hides beneath therapeutic jargon, civil rights law, and public-private collaboration. In the end, democracy ceases to be a forum for political life. It becomes a cult of consensus, a sacred order that brooks no real deviance. Its defenders will say this is necessary to avoid division, extremism, and hate. But a unity that can only be maintained by coercion is not a strength. It is a symptom of fragility. The regimes of old enforced their gods with sword and fire. The new regime enforces its creed with peer pressure, bureaucracy, and reputation metrics. But the effect is the same. A society where one must whisper the truth, where the eyes of power are always watching, and where the freedom to dissent is praised in public but punished in practice. The idea that democracy means rule by the many has always rested on a fragile assumption that mass participation by itself would prevent the concentration of power. It assumes that mechanisms of representation, frequent elections, and free association will continuously disperse authority. But this is not how power behaves. Power does not distribute itself evenly. It concentrates. It seeks direction. It organizes into hierarchy. And wherever hierarchy exists, so too does oligarchy. This is not a theory. It is a law. A political law as consistent as gravity. The law that every complex organization, no matter how democratic in origin, becomes controlled by a small minority. Whether the structure is a republic, a labor union, a political party, or a protest movement, the dynamic remains the same. Leadership is delegated. Delegation becomes control. Control becomes permanence. The few govern the many, and the many believe they are still in charge. What is most sobering about this process is how inescapable it is. Even in the most idealistic and egalitarian contexts, leadership emerges, often out of necessity. Someone must plan, coordinate, negotiate. Decisions must be made. And those who are willing to take responsibility inevitably accrue influence. Influence becomes authority. Authority becomes dominance. The mechanisms of modern democracy do not eliminate this process. They disguise it. Elections give the impression of turnover, but real leadership remains unchanged. Political parties claim to represent the people, but function as centralized machines dominated by long-standing operatives and financial patrons. Parliamentary systems claim to deliberate, but in practice obey a narrow range of interests pre-selected by invisible gatekeepers. The result is that political life becomes less about actual governance and more about managing appearances. Power resides not in those who hold formal office, but in those who control the narratives, the funding, the appointments, the procedures. The deep structures of decision-making remain opaque, even as the ritual of the vote continues. And the citizen? He is encouraged to participate, to voice his views, to protest if he must, but always within prescribed channels. He may speak, but not be heard. He may vote, but not choose. He may complain, but only in ways that reinforce the legitimacy of the system that denies him power. This is the genius of the modern oligarchy. It rules without appearing to. It uses the language of democracy to sanctify its dominance. It rotates faces to preserve the illusion of change. It tolerates a degree of opposition to validate its openness, provided that opposition remains within the frame. The deeper problem is that even those who enter the system with the goal of reforming it are quickly absorbed into its machinery. The system selects for conformity. Those who rise are those who learn to speak its language, embrace its taboos, navigate its rituals. They become part of the same class, maybe with a different aesthetic, a different constituency, a different slogan, but structurally identical. Reform becomes a means of renewal for the oligarchy, not a threat to it. What passes for political contest, then, is largely performative. Elections decide who gets to wear the mask of power, not who governs. The parties offer different flavors of the same administrative consensus. The real battles are fought behind the scenes, among bureaucracies, donors, corporate lobbies, media networks, and judicial cliques. And when genuine outsiders do break through, When a figure or movement emerges that refuses to play by the rules, the system responds with sudden hostility, not with argument, but with exclusion, not with engagement, but with suppression. Investigations, procedural tricks, deplatforming, moral panic. The entire apparatus of liberal democracy reveals itself in these moments as precisely what it claims not to be: a regime built to protect its own class interests. There is, in the end, no escaping the iron law. The only choice is whether one acknowledges it or continues the pretense that the people govern. The reality is this: people do not rule in mass societies. People cannot rule in mass societies. Leadership is always hierarchical. Authority is always exercised by a few. The only question worth asking is whether those few are virtuous, accountable, and bound to the common good, or whether they are hidden, unaccountable, and bound only to themselves. Modern democracy has chosen the latter, and it has done so while convincing its citizens that they are free. Having accepted the inevitability of oligarchy, the next question is existential. What kind of elite does democracy produce? What sort of men rise within this system? What virtues are cultivated? What vices are rewarded? The answer is sobering. For all its lofty claims to freedom, equality, and progress, democracy systematically destroys the very moral foundation upon which those ideals depend. It hollows out the culture that gave birth to it. It replaces civic virtue with bureaucratic compliance, moral law with ideological drift, and foresight with short-term gratification. In doing so, democracy becomes a god that devours its worshippers, promising salvation through freedom, but delivering emptiness through license. At the heart of the problem lies a confusion of ends. Democracy is supposed to be a means, a form of governance through which the people, acting through representatives, can pursue the good. But in the modern era, democracy has become an end in itself. It is no longer asked what democracy serves, but only whether it is inclusive, diverse, and procedurally correct. The good becomes subordinate to the form, and form, in the absence of substance, becomes ritual. This inversion strips political life of meaning. Without a shared conception of the good, without a transcendent aim, democracy becomes a mechanism for managing appetites, not cultivating virtue. Its policies are dictated by polls. Its goals are defined by sentiment. Its legitimacy rests not on truth, but on procedural formalities and emotional appeals. It governs not men, but impulses. This shift has profound consequences. Without a higher aim, politics degenerates into a contest of consumption. Citizens are no longer bound by duty to community or tradition. They are consumers of services, petitioners of rights, clients of the state. The statesman becomes a manager. The legislator becomes a marketer. The ruler becomes a product, sold to the public by consultants and public relations firms. The incentives of democratic politics accelerate this decline. Because leadership is contingent upon popularity, and popularity is driven by immediate satisfaction, the system selects for short-term thinking. It punishes prudence. It discourages restraint. It marginalizes those who speak of sacrifice, hierarchy, or moral limits. The man of virtue is outbid by the man of spectacle. The man of truth is drowned out by the man who flatters. Worse still, democracy encourages a kind of moral flattening. In order to maintain peace among competing desires, it must strip public discourse of moral absolutes. Right and wrong are reduced to preferences. Truth is fragmented into perspectives. Virtue is recast as sentiment. The society that results is not free. It is incoherent. It cannot agree on what is noble, beautiful, or even sane. It drowns in its own multiplicity. And when such a society attempts to justify itself, it can only appeal to abstractions: human rights, personal autonomy, the will of the people. But these abstractions lack the power to bind souls. They are weightless. They cannot command loyalty. They cannot inspire courage. They cannot sustain sacrifice. In times of ease, they may suffice. In times of trial, they evaporate. This is why the democratic order breeds not just political chaos, but spiritual despair. Man, unmoored from tradition and hierarchy, is left to construct his own meaning from scratch. And when he fails, as he inevitably must, he turns either to nihilism or to the empty rituals of modern ideology. He clings to political identity, therapeutic jargon, or digital tribalism. He searches for transcendence in the profane, but he does not find it. The ruling class, for its part, is no longer formed by centuries of inherited responsibility or trained in schools of virtue. It is selected through institutions that reward conformity, credentialism, and managerial instinct. Its members do not think in terms of duty or telos. They think in terms of optics, data, and control. They do not believe in the soul of a nation. They believe in its management. And so, democracy enters its final stage, not with a coup, but with exhaustion. It no longer believes in itself, yet cannot imagine anything else. It preserves the language of freedom, but no longer produces free men. It celebrates equality, but no longer inspires greatness. It multiplies laws, but cannot enforce justice. It holds elections, but cannot produce order. It offers participation, but not belonging. It promises progress, but delivers decline. In this state of civilizational anemia, democracy becomes not a bulwark against tyranny, but a midwife to it. As virtue collapses, as trust erodes, as fragmentation accelerates, the people begin to long for clarity, for strength, for unity, for hierarchy. They begin to look beyond the ballot box. They search for meaning in the ruins. This is the closing irony. Democracy, which claimed to liberate man from hierarchy and tradition, creates the conditions for their return, not as memory, but as necessity. What has been revealed is not simply a critique of democracy's performance, but of its very structure, its metaphysical emptiness, its moral fragility, its inevitable slide into oligarchy. The system that once promised to place man at the center of politics has stripped him of meaning. The regime that claimed to give power to the people has ensured their powerlessness. The form that spoke of liberty has delivered dependence. The modern democratic state, in its obsession with procedure and its fear of transcendence, has severed itself from reality. It governs without grounding. It expands without aim. It survives without love. And yet, it still wears the mask. It still invokes the sacred name of the people. It still holds elections, delivers speeches, builds institutions, and trains citizens to believe that this hollow pageantry is the height of political order. But masks can only hide so much. Beneath the surface, something older stirs. A recognition that man was made not for chaos disguised as freedom, but for order grounded in truth. Not for endless choice, but for right judgment. Not for the tyranny of appetite, but for the sovereignty of the good. The mask is cracking. And when it finally falls, the question will not be whether democracy survives, but whether something truer, nobler, and more enduring will take its place.